Hi everybody, it's me, Billy, and this is Antioch, Chapter 20, Acolyte. Davies pulled back the curtains enough to see who was knocking. It was still dark outside, and his milk shop wouldn't be open for hours, but he'd been up anyway, getting a cow ready for John, whom he expected later that morning. It happened to be John at the door, and Daniel, who was scowling and holding the reins to Michael's white stallion, Aries. Davies said, "Uh-oh, the beggar's here with his hand out." Beth took a peek out the window with him. "Ooh, Davies, you're so rotten." She swatted his backside and squeezed a handful of it. "Give him some milk." He grabbed at her, but she slipped giggling from his clutches and then bounced up the stairs. "Bring him in. It's been at least a week since we had the boys done. I'll get them up." Davies opened the door, leering from thoughts of his wife. "Morning, John. In the market for a milker?" John didn't care for that look on his face. Yes. Well, I've brought Aries here in trade if you don't mind." Davies smiled broadly. "You know, all this time I thought his name was Daniel." He slapped the doorway and laughed. "Sorry, John. I wouldn't trade a good cow for anything from Breog." Daniel's scowl turned a clenched shade of purple. John said, "None of that, Davies, please. We're in a hurry. I know I'm early, but can you get one ready for me?" Davies waved humor aside and came out to pat the horse. "I have done already. I didn't expect this great brute from your end, though. He's Michael's, isn't he? Won't Michael be needing him?" "Michael isn't planning on traveling any time soon." Davies became serious for a rare moment. "What's going on?" John looked up and down what he could see of the street. "I'm sure you'll find out everything at service today. I really don't have the time to get into it right now, and we shouldn't be lingering outside." Beth called out from the parlor. "John, come in and do the boys for us, won't you?" Davies smiled. "Do you have time for that?" John sighed and nodded. He wouldn't refuse a request for hospital. Davies motioned for them to enter. "All right, go on. I'll switch beasts with you while you're at it." John started in. Daniel wouldn't budge. "I'm not going in his house." John paused. "Daniel." Davies smirked. "It's fine, John. He can come around with me." He ruffled Daniel's hair playfully. Daniel ducked away, batting at Davies' hand. "No, I won't." John said, "Daniel, please." Davies laughed. "How about you go around and make the trade then, Breog? We'll put you to work while your uncle puts the whammy on us." Daniel's eyes and mouth popped open in his scowl. "Fergus told him about that? How come Fergus had to go and tell him about that? Wah!" Then the scowl fell away, and Breog's fables leapt out of Daniel's imagination to challenge reality. He didn't know how he hadn't seen it before. "Uncle John's a wizard. He's been putting the whammy on everyone the whole time." Davies took out a ring of keys and twirled them on his finger. "What do you think, old man? Can we trust him?" John frowned then, at everything that had happened, that was happening, and that would happen. "Oh, just do as he says, son. I'll only be a minute in here." He went inside, expecting them to still be arguing when he returned. Davies said, "You do know what a cow looks like, don't you?" Daniel's teeth grated. Davies tossed over the keys. "She's the noisy one in the barn around the way. Just leave your old nag in there and bring her out." Daniel snatched the keys out of the air and stomped off with Aries. "Stupid milkman. Can we trust him? Do you know what a cow looks like? Calls you an old nag. We ought to fix him." He wrenched keys in the lock until one of them worked. Then he threw open the gate and ran his eyes over the buckets, bottles, and breakables inside, searching for a suitable way to wreak his vengeance. The complacent cow therein watched and chewed. Daniel yanked Aries in after him. "I bet if I strung up one of his clangety clang milk buckets on your bridle, you'd wreck his whole place, wouldn't you? How do you think he'd like that?" The stallion's nostrils flared and he snorted. The boy's ranting was agitating him. The cow stopped chewing and backed up. Fortunately, Daniel knew better than to spook a horse in close quarters, and saw he was doing just that. He calmed himself, shushed and cooed, and Aries calmed with him. Daniel gave him an apple and stroked his powerful neck. "You just hurt yourself worse than Davy's dumb old barn, anyhow." When he returned with the cow, he shoved the keys back into Davy's hand. "Ouch! Careful, boy, my palm's not a padlock. Say, you don't look very happy. Is something the matter?" Davies had a baiting grin. "Pwah! Michael's horse is worth twice your old milker." "Fwah yourself, Fish Eyes. Michael's horse will be pulling my dung cart tomorrow." "Ha ha, yes!" John came to the door with one hand unsheathed. "All right, Davies, your turn." He paused at the sight of his grandson's quivering rage. "I think you'd better let the boy alone." Davies said, "It's all right. We were just discussing poor Aries and his short, miserable future of hauling my manure. I suppose when his back finally breaks, he'll be good for nothing but Fergus's stable." He clucked his tongue at the shame of it all. Then he let a little bit of a laugh slip out of the back of his nose. Daniel exploded. He wound up all of his strength and weight and threw his fist like a rock at the milkman's head. Davies didn't see it coming. The blow caught him hard in the nose with a crushing pop. It tied his face into a leaking knot. Davies brought his hands up to the pain and moaned. His nose was broken, bent sideways by Daniel's fury. "Ah! Ugh, you little savage! Why'd you do that?" Shocked, John made a hasty decision. He came up from behind, covered Davies' mouth, flashed him with Rin, and lowered him to the ground. If he'd been fast enough, Davies might not remember any of it. John stood up straight and stiff, looking around like a criminal for witnesses. It was dark enough that he didn't have to worry about the neighbors, and Beth was still asleep on the parlor's couch, but her 5 fine sons had seen everything. They'd gathered in the milk shop's doorway, gaping like a silent choir. Daniel spat on their father. John shooed him away. "That's enough, Daniel!" It was an embarrassing end to John's life in Antioch, but nothing could be done about it. He dragged Davies in out of the street and made the rest of his stops in more of a hurry. Miles away, the sunrise behind them, Daniel sat frowning and with folded arms between a brace of fat pannier bags on the cow's back. John led them from his pinto, also packed for travel. Daniel said, "I don't see what's so special about her," talking about John's horse. John's shoulders rocked with his filly's motion. "Well, she's my horse. That's as special as she needs to be." "You didn't even give her a name." "I haven't thought of one yet. Maybe you could name her." Daniel's frown and arms tucked in tighter. "We should have brought Aries instead. Michael doesn't want him anymore." "Oh, it's not that Michael doesn't want him. He loves that horse. It's just that we need the cow, and Aries is all we had left to trade. At least Michael will get to see him this way." "Davies wants to ruin him!" "I told you, he isn't going to harm that animal. He was only trying to upset you." And he sure got what he was asking for. John looked away, controlling an urge to laugh, not wanting to encourage that sort of behavior in his grandson. "Davies knows livestock, and keeps them well." Daniel thought about that, and saddened. All of ours must have starved to death in their pens. "No, I don't think so. The pigs had dug out on their own by the time I went back, and I opened a few gates." "You went back?" "I did, on my way to Moreau." "Why?" John paused. "I went back to bury them." "Oh." "I buried all of them on that hill by the pond." "That's where Ma is, and Grandpa Isaac." "Much of our family's on that hill." Daniel noticed then that John had said he'd buried all of them, not both of them. "Did somebody else die out there on the farm, Uncle John?" "Oh, yes. I don't know who it was, but I think your father cut his head off with a shovel." Daniel made a frog face. John went on without realizing what an unsettling thing that was to say. "Must have been the one that brought the plague there." "You buried some Bowron up on the hill, with Becca and Pa? Why'd you do that? He's the one that killed them!" John turned in his saddle to look back at Daniel. "He didn't mean to do it, son. He might have been a good man before all of this happened. It seemed like the right thing to do." Daniel struggled with that in silence for 100 yards of the cow's pace, while her stamping and complaining about her swollen udder became more noticeable. She needed to be milked. John looked at her, and then turned around to look back. Satisfied no one was following them, he said, "Let's go ahead and see to this one. I have a lot to tell you, and I don't want to do it while she's bawling at us." They stopped and tied their animals to one of the sturdy thorn bushes that were beginning to dot the countryside. Then they set down a pail and milked the cow together, to her relief. Daniel kept peering at John from the other side of the udder, waiting for him to talk. Steam drifted up from the pail in the morning's chill. John rubbed the back of his head, scratched his beard, and kicked at the ground. Then he came out with it. "Horace was my son." Daniel's mouth fell open. John told the hard version, trying to be honest. "When I met your grandmother, I had already been 16 years in the church, earning my trust. I'd have been thrown out if our relationship came to light, so we kept it a secret. When she told me she was carrying my child, I was distraught. I confided in my brother, Isaac. He offered to marry her, and to claim the baby as his own, for my sake." The regret was plain on his face. "What'd you say to that?" John thought it was quite obvious what he'd said to that, and had to look twice at Daniel before answering. "I brought her to the farm to meet Isaac, and she accepted. It's hard for an unwed mother, especially in Breog. I took my vows, and they raised my son." "Pfwah! And Pa never knew?" "Oh, no, he did. That's what we fought about 18 years ago. That's when he found out." "How come he never told me?" "I don't believe he ever told anyone. I think he might have been protecting me." "Huh?" "Had Abraham found out, well, penalty for what I've done is serious. I think your father kept my secret with that in mind." How come you're telling me? I don't want to keep the same secret from you. Things might have been different had I been honest. Daniel thought about the story. Then he said, Do you wish you hadn't done it, Uncle John? John sighed. He didn't expect Daniel to start calling him Grandpa right there on the spot, but Uncle John was a significant name to bear. It was the only one his son had ever called him. I've often wondered what life would have been like if I'd stayed home and raised a family instead. If I'd have been happy on the farm, or a good father. Isaac was happy. I visited them often. I think your grandmother fell in love with him. No, I mean, do you wish you hadn't done it with Grandma? John grimaced. Daniel, that's coarse. But it wasn't a good time for a lecture on social graces. No, I'm glad to be here with you now. And really, I've never regretted your father. I had no reason to. He kept me from nothing that I wanted. My only regrets now are the things I wanted. Those change over the years, you see. Eventually, I became jealous of my good brother, and sorry I'd chosen the church. Daniel thought some more and nodded. I guess we'd be dead if you didn't. He drank raw milk out of the bucket. John was surprised by Daniel's response, having expected outrage or disappointment. Daniel said, What are we going to do with all the extra milk, Uncle John? We'll get 3 or 4 buckets a day. Oh, spill it out when we move on, I suppose. Did we bring some vinegar? Fergus showed me how to make a cheese. John laughed. Cheese? I don't think we're packed for making cheese. He drank some of the raw milk himself and wiped his mouth. That's that, then. His secret was out. John stood up and looked around. We need to get moving. Listen, Daniel, I can't go the whole way without sleep this time. I'll be staying up at night. You'll have to stand watch during the day to let me rest. Daniel's expression took on some frog. John said, There's nothing to worry about. There's no safer place in the world than with me. If you see anything, just wake me up. He motioned at the milk. Have you had enough? Yes, sir. John poured out the bucket. It's time to go, then. There are no roads from here to Golgotha. I'm hoping we can cover 20 miles a day. They plodded mostly west and slightly south over browner and browner hills stubbled with those dense, thorny bushes. John had stories about the circle, devils, and heroics. Daniel had stories about growing up on the farm with Rebecca and Horace. Each was fond of the others. That evening they tethered their animals on a windless hillside. There wasn't enough room between the brambles to lie down, and Daniel wondered how they were going to sleep. Before the boy could ask, the old man stooped, shoved his armored hands into a stout shrub, and ripped it up with its roots out of the earth and rocks. He tossed it aside like a weed, and pulled another. Daniel gaped. You're strong as a donkey, Uncle John. John laughed and continued chucking shrubs away from a broadening patch of ground. Daniel flattened it out. Then he gathered dry branches and leaves into a pile in the clearing's center and went to work with his tinderbox. John stopped him. Watch this, son. He struck one of Captain's matches on his gauntlet. The boy stood transfixed on the hissing, spitting little stick's ignition. John enjoyed Daniel's reaction. It's a sailor trick. They call it a lucifer. It lit the tinder easily. I didn't know sailors could do stuff like that. Oh, they're full of surprises. Do you want some? I've got a whole box. Yes, sir. Daniel sat and struck match after match, each brimstone flash more fascinating than the last. When the flames neared his fingers, he'd toss it into the campfire and draw another. Where does the fire come from? How do they work? John unloaded the animals, hoisting 100 pounds at a time. I don't know. Captain called it chemistry. Wizardry. The matches snapped, sparked, and smoked. The surrounding bushes started to glow on the fireside against the dusk and made twisted black talons in the darkening shadows. John's gauntlets hung from his belt as he rummaged through their grounded baggage. He took out a skin of cider, a jar of pickled apples, a package of venison jerky, and an Acolyte's tabard. John said, Daniel, I want to talk about why we had to leave. Daniel turned and saw John inspecting the blank garment, holding it up from where it would fold over the shoulders. It was a brilliant white strip in the firelight against the night blue sky. Daniel's match singed his fingers and broke his stare. John folded the cloth over his arm and brought it over with the food. We're going to start a new church. I'm going to teach you everything I know. Daniel pointed at the tabard. That's for me? Oh, yes. I thought you might like it. John tossed it into the boy's lap. Daniel held it up, his face wide open. I'm going to be in the church? Then he narrowed. What about that old rascal Abraham? What's he going to try? Don't worry about Abraham. We're never going to see him again. John opened the jar and the package on the ground between them, drank from the cider skin, and passed it to Daniel. Every time we stop for the night, we'll practice a little, after dinner. John smiled and popped a pickled apple into his mouth. His smile cinched up like a drawstring pouch. Tart! Daniel was mesmerized by the tabard. The taste of spicy, chewy meat and sour apple slices stayed under his racing imagination. He put food into his mouth automatically. John said, "I want you to know that I'm not going to lie to you." Daniel descended from a fantasy. "What?" "I want you to know you can trust me." "I trust you, Uncle John." "Uncle—" John shook his head. He questioned the decision he'd made to tell Daniel the truth. Was he too young for such things? Was it the right thing to do? Does it matter? Regardless of the answers to those questions, John would never have to worry about Daniel finding out on his own. "Okay, put that thing on. Let's get started." Daniel stood and pulled his head through the collar. The garment swung loose from his front and back like long lily petals. John smiled at him. "Good, but we can't have it waving around like that." Daniel was wearing brown and whites with suspenders. He looked around, trying to figure out how to tie the tabard to his waist. John went to the packs again. He came back, unrolling a thick leather belt that had a sturdy steel buckle in one heavy, riveted end. John handed it over. "This should work. It's made to hold a sword." Daniel held it, appreciating the weight and craftsmanship. Jacob had punched neat and even pairs of prong holes near 40 inches, fit for John. When Daniel wrapped it on and tightened it to 25 inches, he found some rougher holes John had stabbed through the leather with a nail. A pair of them fit well, and he tucked the extra length downward through the inside. John nodded. Now you look like an acolyte. Here, lie down." Daniel lay back on his blanket, curious about what sort of exercises he'd have to do to get strong enough to rip thorn bushes out of the ground. Even his massive father couldn't have done that. John knelt next to him and said, "All you have to do is try to stay awake, son. If you feel you've fallen asleep, try your best to wake up, okay?" That sounded easy enough. "Yes, sir." "We'll have to wait a few more minutes, though, now that I think about it." "Why?" "Otherwise you won't remember what I just told you to do." John laughed, but Daniel had to think about it. When John placed his hand on Daniel's forehead, the boy suddenly felt he'd fallen asleep. He opened his eyes. The sun was rising and John was kneeling next to the campfire, having made breakfast. Daniel sat up. "What happened?" "Oh, you're awake." John's joints cracked in a stretch. "Did you dream?" Daniel pointed at himself, at the blanket, and at John. Did I fail?" John tried to reassure him while yawning. "Oh, no. No one gets it right away. You have to get used to it. Don't worry. We'll try again tonight. You'll get closer each time." He brought over a warm cast-iron skillet filled with crusty bacon and potatoes. Then he went to his own blanket and fell down. "I'm so tired. Milk the cow for something to do. Keep an eye out. Wake me up at noon." John was asleep before the confused and discouraged boy could say, "Yes, sir." Daniel had gone from one instant to the next without so much as a dream. John's bestial snoring began, and the cow called for attention. She was noisy. Daniel frowned, ate, and then went to get a pail. He became uneasy squatting down behind the animal's mass. She blocked too much of his field of vision. He went to the other side, hoping to be more comfortable there, but the top of the hill was much too close. There could be an army of Bowron just over the rise. He'd have to watch that. John's snore put them in constant danger of attracting attention as well. It took Daniel almost 2 hours to fill the bucket because he kept poking his head up to look around after every few squeezes of the teats. No monsters appeared. The animals grazed in the shrubs. It was still a long time before noon. Daniel drank some milk and started to get bored. Then he went to rummage through the packs. "Uncle John, where are those pickles?" He said it absent-mindedly, not intending to wake him. John rolled over, the torture in a dream transformed by his grandson's voice. "No, it is a pickled pork chop." Daniel had no idea what that meant, and gave it only a moment's consideration before continuing his search for the apples. Halfway through the first pack, he found one of John's tabards, not the plain, blank designation of an acolyte, but the high-collared, golden-embroidered standard of a paladin. He felt suddenly like a thief to touch it. He opened it up and traced his fingers through the circle's insignias, one on the front and one on the back, each half an inch deep and 6 inches wide on the inside. This might make a good strainer. Inspired, he put it aside and unloaded the rest of the bag to the bottom, discovering it was watertight. I'll have to put a hole in that. He needed something sharp, like a knife. Daniel's eyebrows went up, and he turned to look at John's caligan. It lay on the ground next to John. Daniel crept over and picked it up. Jacob had replaced the scabbard that John had burned. The weapon felt much more forbidden and valuable than the tabard. It was heavy, like lifting an axe, a spade, a pick, and a pitchfork all at the same time. Daniel slid the bright steel out of its sheath and handled it with careful awe. It was beautiful. He posed with it and scanned the horizon, thinking he might just kill a Bowron if he saw one, rather than wake John. Surely he could destroy anything with such a sword. His eyes narrowed on one of the thorn bushes. Daniel brought the blade back and swung with all of his strength, expecting to cut the bush in half, for branches to fly from a flat cleft. The springy shrub disappointed him, absorbing his attack and twisting the grip in his hands. The Callaghan felt then more like a heavy club than a sword, and Daniel's arms were getting tired. He dragged it over to the empty pannier bag and used the point to work a hole through the leather. Then he put John's weapon back and eventually found the pickled apples in another bag. Daniel spread out the tabard on the ground next to a bucket of milk, surveyed his work, and nodded with satisfaction. Everything was ready. Mise in place. He poured the pickles and their vinegar into the milk, which curdled right away. He poured that into one of the tabard's golden circles, where it made a lumpy pile of curds and apple wedges. Folding it all up into shape with the tabard's second circle, he put it into the bottom of the punctured pannier bag and repacked on top of it to press the whey out of his cheese. He woke John at noon, and they set out again. An ease developed between the two of them. John was happy Daniel was accepting him. Daniel looked forward to surprising John with what he'd done. When they stopped that evening to camp, Daniel brought out his pressed curds. John was taken aback. The old man examined the damage to the bag as the boy bragged about his improvised mise en place, and about overcoming all odds to make cheese in the wilderness. The bag and everything in it smelled like apple cider vinegar. John didn't understand how Daniel could have treated their equipment like that. But, you made cheese in our saddlebags. Daniel's face fell. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. He started to fear he'd be punished. He sure didn't want a wallop from someone stronger than his father. And you used a tabard of the circle as a cheesecloth. John started laughing. It does make a nice round, doesn't it? Daniel didn't laugh. He was still too nervous. John put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. Son, this is the first official cheesecloth of the Church of Golgotha. That calls for a celebration. I'll get the cider. John came back with a cider skin and the cast-iron skillet. You've got to brown a sacred wheel like that. It's the only way to do it right. Fergus browns it too. Well, he's the one who showed me to eat it that way. The cheese was 2 inches thick and the width of the circle across, with pickled apples snug in its shape. I've never seen him put apples in a cheese, though. Was that your idea? Yes, sir. I thought it might taste good to leave them in. I think it will. John held the pan over the campfire, using his gauntlet as an oven mitt, and gave the cheese a rich brown crust on each side. Then he turned it out onto his other hand, sat down and broke it into halves. They tasted it at the same time, both to mild disappointment. Daniel said, I forgot the salt. John looked sly. How could you? It's the most important thing in the kitchen. Daniel laughed. John went on, Would you say this needs butter or salt? Daniel rolled his eyes and took another bite of the bland, crusty, sour apple cheese. It had a pleasant density and meatiness. There were some good things about it. John's half was gone before Daniel's. John said, You should make it again tomorrow. I've some salt packed. We've another 3 jars of pickles. There's certainly enough milk to get it right. When you saw I poked a hole in the bag, I thought I was in for a wallop. John gave him a kind smile. Never be afraid of that. Are you ready to practice some more? Yes, sir. Daniel lay down stiff with his fists at his sides, concentrating. I won't fall asleep this time. I won't fall asleep this time. I won't. John put his hand on Daniel's forehead. Daniel woke up with the sunrise. Why? What am I doing wrong? John laughed and yawned. Nothing. You have to get used to it. Did you dream? No. How long before I can do it? John fell onto his blanket. Milk the cow. Make cheese. He left a pouch of salt and a jar of pickled apples on top of the official cheesecloth, which was in a tidy fold. John had assumed the tabard and the bag would start to stink of sour milk, but they didn't. Everything still smelled of apple cider vinegar. That night John fried the cheese, and it was perfect. He was impressed. He finished his half first again, and then tried to steal some of Daniel's. The boy laughed, holding it out of the old man's reach. That is the end of Chapter 20. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99, or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for Chapter 21, The Road to Golgotha.